So, as promised, here is part 2 on wood. Enjoy.
Wood grows in a particular way. A tree starts out as a very thin seedling. The grain is oriented vertically. It goes up and down. And if we fail to keep George Washington away and he cuts the little tree down, his hatchet will be cutting across the grain. If he lets it live, it will accumulate a layer of new wood around the original stick, and it will do this every year. This process of adding a layer every year does not take place on the surface. It happens under the bark. After 10 years, if George then cuts it down and we take a look at the stump, we will see 10 concentric rings, 10 circles, one inside the other, each made up of the growth that took place in 1 year. These are the growth rings, and are visible on the end grain of a log or a board. We can count the rings and tell how old a tree is. This photograph shows a section of a tree that started growing around the year 900. The white rings that you see indicate dates such as the signing of the Magna Carta, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and so forth. If the tree has a good year with lots of moisture, it will grow a lot that year and produce a thick growth ring. If it has a bad year because of drought and does not grow much, the tree will produce a thin ring that year. The rings are made of early growth, which is formed in the spring when water is plentiful, and late growth, which is formed later in the year. Some trees produce growth rings that are hard to see. In other words, there's very little difference between the early wood and the late growth wood. These trees are called ring diffuse. Other species show a big difference between early and late growth, and each growth ring is made up of a solid part with very small tubes, and another, sometimes softer part, made up of much larger tubes. These are called ring porous woods. As you're beginning to see, there's a huge variety of woods, and they differ from one another in many ways. Biologically, there are 2 broad categories of lumber trees. Coniferous trees have been around on Earth longer. They include pine, spruce, fir, redwood, cedar, and others. Conifers produce seed cones, have needles rather than leaves, and produce wood with just one kind of fiber. Conifers are usually called softwoods, even though some of them, such as red pine, are quite hard enough to be used as flooring. Deciduous trees have broad leaves that die each fall, and include oak, maple, walnut, cherry, birch, poplar, and others. Deciduous trees have 3 kinds of fiber in their wood: large thin-walled tubes to hold water and nutrients, narrow thick-walled fibers for strength, and middling-sized tubes for transporting water and nutrients. Deciduous trees are usually called hardwoods, and on average they are harder than coniferous woods. Yet balsa, the softest and least dense wood, comes from a deciduous tree. Different woods have different densities and are lighter or heavier as a result. Some of the densest woods are denser than water and as a result will not float. The hardness of wood is related to its density, but is not exactly the same thing. Hardness is measured by how difficult the wood is to dent. You can dent balsa with your thumbnail. You would need a steel nail to put a dent into maple. Hardness is not the same thing as strength. Some very hard woods are brittle and tend to snap off under stress. Some of the softwoods are among the strongest, able to carry heavy loads. We build houses from softwood 2x4s. Wood can vary according to how it is sawn or cut, with each procedure resulting in different working characteristics and appearance. Wood can be plain sawn or quarter sawn. Plain sawn wood is cut so that a log produces the most lumber. It is the most economical way to cut boards. It produces boards with grain that is parallel with the rings, and it produces a dramatic, broad figure. Quarter sawn wood is cut perpendicular to the rings. This produces fewer boards, but it emphasizes certain aspects of the figure, such as rays. Wood can be cut into very thin veneer, and this can be done through two different processes, rotary cutting or flitch cutting, each producing a different figure. Wood can be kiln dried, air dried, or green, which is to say, not dried, each with different levels of stability. The moisture content of wood can be an important consideration in a number of ways. When the moisture content changes, wood moves. It changes size. And it does so differently depending on several factors. Some species are more stable than others. Wood changes least along its length with the grain. We would say it is more stable along its length. Quarter sawn wood is more stable than plain sawn wood. This is because the least stable dimension is tangential to the growth rings. Because of this instability, a log is prone to crack in a particular way called a check crack. These cracks tend to run radially from the center to the outside of the log. For this reason, lumber should not be left in the log for long. When it is sawn, the tension is relieved and there's less cracking. Because of the shrinkage tangential to the rings, plain sawn boards may tend to curl, while quarter sawn boards tend to remain flat to a greater degree. For the most part, we must take wood as we find it, discover its qualities, and adapt to them. Trees did not evolve to produce wood for us to use. They evolved features that allow them to live, grow, and reproduce in many different environments. The structure of wood gives a tree a system for circulation, and it gives it the strength that trees are famous for. That being said, industry has found many ways to process wood and produce materials that take advantage of the characteristics of the wood fibers and combining them in ways that surpass the qualities of solid lumber. Think of plywood, particle board, oriented strand board, fiber board, and paper and cardboard. Choosing the ideal wood for miniatures depends on the specific application. The framework of a dollhouse has certain requirements that are different from the demands of a miniature dining room chair. The factors to consider include expense, availability, color, aesthetic beauty, strength in tension and compression, hardness, which is not the same thing as strength, coarse versus fine grain, various types of flexibility, including whether it can be steamed and bent, smoothness, fuzziness, and how difficult it is to cut with a blade, a saw, a chisel, a plane, a drill bit, various powered blades, or sandpaper. Often we're faced with choosing a wood that's optimal, as good as we can get, and yet not ideal. All of these considerations, which apply to full-size woodworking, have different implications for miniature woodworking. The range of woods suited for miniature work is not the same as the range suitable for full-size building or full-sized furniture. Open-grained woods such as oak, ash, and pine beautiful and functional in full-sized work, have a texture that is usually too coarse for miniatures. The issue is one of scale. When an object is modeled in miniature, all aspects of the object need to be proportionately smaller and finer. The upholstery patterns, the drawer knobs, and the figure of the wood. If we're trying to represent an oak kitchen work table, and actually make it out of oak, the grain would be in effect magnified by a factor of 12. Imagine being a 6-inch tall person with tiny eyeballs and fingers standing at such a table. Our tiny cook would be losing substantial portions of their dough in the massive cracks. Pine could be even worse, with its alternating stripes of hard and soft wood. Other woods, regarded as high-quality furniture wood, such as mahogany and walnut, have a finer grain, and in fact may give good scaled-down representations of a coarse-grained wood such as oak. Other woods are even more fine-grained, and work well and look good in most miniature applications. These include cherry, other fruit woods, maple, poplar, and basswood. Maple and the fruit woods share a characteristic with oak, but on a much smaller scale, and this may be a great advantage. Oak, if it is quarter sawn, shows the rays within the log. These are fibers which are not oriented along the length of the wood like typical grain. Rays radiate, thus the name, from the center of the log across the grain to the outside of the log, and carry nutrients from the outside of the tree towards the center and vice versa. Depending on how the log is cut, plain sawn versus quarter sawn, these rays may produce broad sweeping patterns across the grain, and as a matter of fact, oak is often selected for these patterns. All deciduous woods have rays. Some are large and dramatic, like oaks, and some are small and are usually referred to as a ray fleck. If you look closely at fruit wood and maple, you will see that they have very tiny rays, which can make them a good scale rendition of oak, a popular wood for full-size furniture and interior trim. Craft wood is sold in sheets and strips in hobby stores and from online miniature suppliers, and that is usually either basswood or balsa. Balsa is very light, soft, and weak, more so than any other kind of wood I know of. It also has a fairly coarse grain compared with basswood. This makes it ideal for a very limited range of miniature applications. One might think that it would be easy to cut, but in fact it's so soft that it tends to crush rather than cut. A very sharp blade is required to get a clean cut in balsa, and sawing is liable to leave a very rough surface. I use balsa for one thing, and that is to form the shape of a cushion under upholstery fabric on a chair or a couch. I use it for little else. Basswood, on the other hand, is probably the single most useful wood there is for miniatures. I work with basswood more than any other wood. It is soft enough to cut with a craft knife, and yet has adequate strength for many constructions. Basswood is available in a wide range of dimensions and from specialty suppliers. You probably won't find it at your local lumber yard. It is nearly white and very consistent in color, with very few knots, marks, or flaws. It does well as a scaled representation of a blonde wood such as poplar or maple. When stained, it makes a fair but not pretty representation of oak or walnut, but it can sometimes take stain unevenly. Basswood takes glue and paint well, but ideally should have a primer coat such as gesso when painted. Basswood can be purchased precisely machined to a specific thickness. a 32nd of an inch, a 16th of an inch, 3/32, 1/8, 3/16, and a quarter. I have even seen some odd thicknesses, such as 5/64. This is a great boon for the miniaturist. Wood that is 1/8 of an inch thick is a close 1/12 scale representation of 2-inch dimensional lumber, such as 2x4s or 2x6s. We discussed this when we talked about scales. With so many thicknesses available, you never need to worry about having to adjust the thickness. You can take it off the shelf and just cut the width and length, and that's all very convenient. I have included a few other woods in my miniature work: cherry, walnut, mahogany, and maple. A miniature desk or cabinet made of cherry or walnut is very attractive and authentic. This is not everything we could say about wood, and we'll be returning to the subject as we deal with other issues and topics. But this is sufficient to our purposes for now. You can learn a lot more about wood from a book by Bruce Hoadley entitled simply Understanding Wood. Hoadley was an early contributor to Fine Woodworking magazine, and you can also find some of his articles in back issues of that magazine. So until next time then, always remember and never forget,